She had just brought 2 legacies into the world. Her body was still trembling from the effort. Her eyes were clouded with the kind of raw, exhausted joy that only follows a battle for life. And the man she married, the heir to the Kang syndicate, the man who once claimed she was the only light in his dark world, stood at the edge of the sterile light and looked at her like she was a stain he needed to bleach away. He didn't reach for his daughters, he didn't even look at them. Instead, he adjusted his watch, his movements cold and architecturally precise. Then he spoke the words that would eventually burn his empire to the ground. The private suite at the clinic smelled of white tea and antiseptic, expensive, clinical, and devoid of warmth. Naomi lay against the pillows, her skin still flushed from an 18-hour labor that had rewired her soul. Her hair was damp against her forehead, coiling in the dark, messy patterns of a woman who had survived something real. In her arms, she held the quiet miracle of their blended worlds. She looked up at him, her lips trembling into the ghost of a smile, still reaching for a warmth in him that no longer existed. Do-won didn't move. His eyes, unreadable and dark, swept over her face and her body with a visceral, jagged recoil. "You disgust me," he whispered. "This is not the woman I married." Subscribe to this channel as we continue this amazing story. The discharge from the clinic didn't come with a wheelchair or a nurse's steadying hand. It came with a security guard whose eyes remained fixed on the middle distance and a manila envelope that felt as cold as dry ice against Naomi's skin. The painkillers from the surgery were wearing off, leaving a jagged, white-hot thrumming in her lower abdomen that synchronized with the frantic beating of her heart. In her arms, the double car seat carrier was a heavy, plastic anchor, housing 2 sleeping infants who were blissfully unaware that their father had just deleted their existence from his ledger. The lobby of the Elite Soul Clinic was a cathedral of glass and silence, designed for people who bought privacy like others bought bread. But as Naomi stepped through the automatic doors, the silence was shattered by the humid, indifferent roar of the city. There was no black sedan waiting, no driver in white gloves. There was only the curb, the smell of exhaust, and the realization that she was no longer Mrs. Kang Do-won. She stood there, her legs trembling under a pair of maternity leggings that felt too loose now, her hair matted at the nape of her neck. She looked down at the manila envelope tucked under her arm. Inside there were no divorce papers, those would have required a process, a mediation, a trace of respect. There was only an annulment decree based on fraudulent pretenses, a non-disclosure agreement with a pen already clipped to it, and a single, crisp $100 bill. The bill was the ultimate insult. It wasn't for survival, it was a tip. It was the price Do-won's mother, Lady Kang, paid for a meal she didn't finish. Naomi felt a hysterical laugh bubble up in her throat, tasting like copper and bile. 10 years of fixing the Kang syndicate's most dangerous leaks, 3 years of marriage, 2 children, all appraised at the value of a single Benjamin Franklin. "He isn't coming, is he?" she whispered, her voice a ghost of the commanding tone she used to wield in the syndicate's war rooms. The bobbies stirred. One of them, the boy with Do-won's distinct, arched brow, let out a soft, mewling cry. The sound acted like a lightning strike to her nervous system. The grief, the why of it all, the memory of Do-won's face as he recoiled from her in the hospital bed, it all retreated into a dark corner of her mind. In its place, a cold, familiar architecture began to rise. It was the fixer taking over. The woman who had once navigated hostile takeovers in Singapore and handled blackmailers in Milan didn't have time for a broken heart. She had a logistics problem. She looked at the $100 bill. To anyone else, it was a tragedy. To Naomi Sinclair, it was a seed. She walked to the edge of the curb, her every step a calculated defiance against the physical pain radiating from her stitches. She didn't call a friend. In the Kang world, friends were just spies with better manners. She didn't call her mother, who had passed away years ago, or her father, whose memory was a locked box she hadn't dared open. Instead, she raised a shaking hand and flagged a yellow taxi, the kind the Kangs wouldn't be caught dead in. "Where to?" the driver asked, looking at the pale woman and the 2 infants with a mixture of pity and annoyance. "The district of Mapo," Naomi said, her voice hardening, regaining its edge. "The corner of 2nd and Beek Bayam." As the taxi pulled away from the clinic, she watched her reflection in the window. She looked shattered. Her eyes were sunken, her skin sallow. But beneath the exhaustion, there was a flicker of something the Kangs had forgotten about her. They thought they had married a socialite they could mold. They forgot they had hired a woman who knew where every body was buried because she was the one who had dug the graves. She reached into the manila envelope again, searching past the insulting cash. Her fingers brushed against something hard and small, wedged into the very bottom corner. It was a key, not a modern electronic fob, but an old-fashioned brass key with a numbered tag. It hadn't been put there by Do-won or his mother. It was wrapped in a small piece of parchment that smelled faintly of the expensive tobacco her father used to smoke. Property 43B, the door is always open for a Sinclair. Her father had been dead for 5 years or so the world believed. He had been the ghost partner, the man who built the foundation of the Kang syndicate while the Kangs took the credit and the sunlight. He had always told her that the Kangs were like decorative ivy, they looked beautiful and strong, but they only grew because they clung to a structure they didn't own. The taxi hit a pothole and Naomi winced, her hand instinctively flying to her stomach. She looked down at her sons. They were the only things in this world that weren't tainted by the syndicate's ink. "You think you left me with nothing," she murmured, the words directed at the penthouse she could see receding in the distance, where Do-won was likely sitting in a leather chair, washing the memory of her away with a 30-year-old scotch. "You think you stripped me of my name, my money, and my beauty." She looked at the $100 bill and then at the brass key. "But you forgot one thing, Do-won, you left me with my mind, and that's the only thing that ever made you powerful in the first place." The taxi dropped her off in front of a weathered gray brick building that looked like a relic of a forgotten era. It was a loft in a neighborhood that smelled of fried oil and old books, a far cry from the marble halls of the Kang estate. She stood on the sidewalk, the car seat heavy in her grip, the wind whipping her thin hospital gown against her skin. She was marooned, she was bleeding, she was broke. But as she turned the key into the heavy oak door of Property 43B, the disgusting woman Do-won had walked away from died on that curb. In her place, a ghost was waking up. And this ghost was going to spend every cent of that $100 making sure the Kang syndicate learned the true meaning of a hostile takeover. She stepped inside, the door clicking shut behind her, severing her connection to the world that had discarded her. The long game had begun. The dust in Property 43B didn't dance. It hung heavy and stagnant like a held breath. As Naomi stepped further into the loft, the clicking of the heavy oak door behind her sounded like a gavel brought down on her old life. The air smelled of cedar, old parchment, and the metallic tang of an industrial past, a stark contrast to the sterile, floral-scented betrayal of the clinic. She set the double car seat on a scarred mahogany table, her movements stiff and robotic. Her body was screaming, a symphony of post-surgical fire and exhaustion, but her mind was already beginning to strip away the Naomi who had been a wife and mother, revealing the N who had been a weapon. She ignored the plush velvet sofa and the kitchen that looked as though it hadn't seen a meal in a decade. Her eyes were fixed on the far wall where a massive, floor-to-ceiling bookshelf of dark walnut stood. It wasn't the books she was interested in. She remembered her father's voice, a low rumble from a childhood spent in the shadows of the syndicate's expansion. The Kangs build monuments to their ego, Naomi. A Sinclair builds the foundation. If you want to see the truth of a building, you don't look at the penthouse, you look at the blueprints in the basement. With the bobbies finally settled into a deep, rhythmic sleep, Naomi approached the shelf. Her fingers, still trembling slightly, traced the spines of leather-bound ledgers until she found it, a nondescript volume titled Architecture of Internal Flows, 1994-2004. It was a title so boring it was invisible. She pulled it and a section of the shelving clicked, receding an inch before sliding to the right. Behind it sat a safe, but not a digital one. This was a mechanical beast, a rotating dial that required a tactile intimacy the modern world had forgotten. Naomi closed her eyes. She didn't need to see the numbers, she needed to feel the tumblers. Her father had taught her this at 7 years old, turning it into a game of listening to the iron. Right to 18, the hour of her birth. Left to 40, the percentage the Kangs thought they had bought but had only leased. Right to 3, the number of men it took to kill a legacy. The heavy door groaned open. Inside lay the ghost ledger. It wasn't a book, but a series of black flash drives and a stack of physical stock certificates printed on heavy, cream-colored paper with the Kang syndicate's original seal, a tiger entwined with a serpent. Naomi pulled them out, her breath hitching. These weren't just papers, they were the title deeds to a kingdom. She sat at the mahogany table, lit only by a single dim bulb hanging from the ceiling, and cracked open her father's laptop, a custom-built machine that looked like a rugged military brick. As the screen hummed to life, the blue light cast long, skeletal shadows across her face. She inserted the first drive. The data that flooded the screen was a map of a massacre. For 30 years, her father, Arthur Sinclair, had been the silent architect of every major Kang acquisition. He hadn't just brokered the deals, he had structured them so that a ghost stake of 40% was diverted into a series of shell companies, companies that were now, according to the encrypted files, legally owned by Naomi. The Kangs, Do-won and his mother, the venomous Lady Kang, believed they owned the majority. They believed they had the power to cast Naomi out with $100 because they thought she was an ornament. They didn't realize they were living in a house where she owned the land, the walls, and the very air they breathed. "You focused on my face, Do-won," Naomi whispered to the empty room, her eyes scanning lines of code and fiduciary hierarchies. "You looked at my skin and my weight and my disgusting vulnerability. You forgot to look at the math." As she dug deeper, she found the kill switch. It was a series of offshore accounts and poison pill provisions embedded in the syndicate's upcoming IPO. Her father had planned for this. He had known that the Kang's greed would eventually turn them into predators against their own. The ledger detailed every bribe Lady Kang had paid to the Seoul district prosecutors, every offshore account used to hide the syndicate's gambling revenue, and every illegal merger that formed the spine of their current empire. Naomi felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over her. The pain in her body faded, replaced by the thrill of the hunt. She wasn't just a discarded wife anymore, she was the auditor of their sins. She began to type, her fingers flying across the keys with the precision of a concert pianist. She wasn't ready to strike yet. A ghost doesn't scream, it haunts. She began setting up a series of digital tripwires. She moved the 40% stake behind a new encryption layer, rebranding the holding company as the N Group. She started the process of bleeding the Kang's minor subsidiaries, slowly, almost imperceptibly, so they would think it was just market volatility. A soft cry came from the car seat. Naomi paused, her hands hovering over the keys. She walked over and lifted her daughter, the tiny girl who looked so much like her, with wide, searching eyes. She held the baby against her chest, the warmth of the small body a stark contrast to the cold data on the screen. "They think we are nothing," she murmured into the baby's hair. "They think we are ghosts, but ghosts are the only things you can't kill twice." She looked back at the screen, at the map of the Kang Empire. It was a sprawling, golden web of power, but she could see the frayed edges now. She could see where her father had left the shears. By the time the sun began to bleed through the grime of the loft's windows, Naomi had mapped out the first 3 moves of her long game. She had identified the syndicate's weakest link, a luxury shipping merger that Do-won was personally overseeing. If that merger failed, the IPO would stagger. If the IPO staggered, the board would panic. And when the board panicked, they would go looking for a savior. They would go looking for End. Naomi closed the laptop and tucked the brass key into the pocket of her maternity leggings. The $100 bill sat on the table, ignored. She didn't need their money, she had their soul. She stood up, her posture straighter than it had been since the moment of the twins' birth. The disgusting woman was gone. The ghost partner had returned to the table, and for the first time in his life, Kang Do-won was playing against an opponent he couldn't see, couldn't charm, and couldn't break. The architecture of revenge was complete. Now it was time to build. Loft was a cavern of secrets, but it was the digital ones that began to bleed. Naomi sat at the mahogany table, the blue light of the laptop carving hollows into her cheeks as she navigated the encrypted cloud storage her father had labeled the mirror. Outside, the rain began to lash against the Mapo district brickwork, a rhythmic morning sound that matched the steady pulse of her own recovery. She had expected to find financial ledgers, bank routing numbers, and shell company registrations. She had found those, but nestled within a folder dated the week of her wedding was something far more sinister, a direct feed into the Kang estate's internal security system. Her father hadn't just been a partner, he had been a voyeur of the highest order. He had known that to survive the Kangs, one had to see them when they thought they were alone. Naomi's breath hitched as she clicked on a file marked Private Study, Lady Kang. The video was timestamped only 4 hours before Do-won had walked into her hospital room at the clinic. The resolution was crisp, capturing the gold leaf molding of the matriarch's office and the sharp, predatory silhouette of Lady Kang sitting behind a desk of black obsidian. Do-won was there too. He wasn't the cold, immovable mountain he had been at the hospital. In this room, under his mother's gaze, he looked smaller. He was packing, his jacket off, his sleeves rolled up in a way that suggested a man coming apart at the seams. "She is the mother of my children, mother," Do-won's voice came through the speakers, cracked and desperate. "The labor it was difficult, she almost didn't make it." Lady Kang didn't look up from her paperwork, she moved a fountain pen with the precision of a surgeon. "She is a Sinclair, Do-won, she is a parasite masquerading as a partner. You married her for the optics of a unified front, but look at her now. She is soft. She is broken. She has spent 18 hours wallowing in the mess of her own biology." "She was beautiful," Do-won whispered, and the sound of it sent a fresh wave of agony through Naomi's chest. "She was an asset," Lady Kang corrected, finally looking up. Her eyes were like chips of flint. Now she is a liability. If you want to lead the syndicate into the IPO, you cannot have a woman at your side who makes you feel pity. Pity is the rot that kills an empire. You will go to that clinic, you will look at her, and you will see exactly what I tell you to see." Naomi watched, her hand over her mouth, as Lady Kang stood and walked toward her son. She didn't hug him. She took his face in her hands, her thumbs pressing into his jawline with a terrifying, practiced intimacy. "Repeat it," Lady Kang commanded, "the script we discussed." Do-won hesitated. "Mother." "Repeat it. If you want your children to have the Kang name, if you want them to inherit a world and not a grave, you will sever the limb that is infected with Sinclair blood. Say the words." The video caught the exact moment Do-won's spine straightened. It was as if a veil fell over his eyes, a programmed coldness sliding into place. "She is a mistake," he murmured, his voice becoming the monotone steel Naomi remembered from the hospital. "She is repulsive. She is not the woman I married." Again, Lady Kang whispered, a ghost of a smile touching her thin lips. With more conviction, "She is a stain on the lineage. You are disgusted by her." "I am disgusted by her," Do-won repeated. The video ended there, the screen flickering back to a black void. Naomi sat in the silence of the loft, the air suddenly feeling too thin to breathe. It hadn't been a sudden change of heart. It hadn't been the shock of seeing her in pain. It had been a rehearsal, a performance directed by a woman who viewed human emotion as a coding error to be deleted. Do-won hadn't looked at her and felt disgust. He had looked at her and felt the crushing weight of his mother's thumb on his soul. But the understanding brought no forgiveness. If anything, the realization that Do-won was a puppet made the betrayal feel more pathetic, more absolute. He had chosen the crown over the woman who had nearly died to give him heirs. He had allowed himself to be weaponized. "He didn't even have the courage to hate me on his own," Naomi whispered, her voice raspy. She turned back to the keyboard. The grief was still there, a heavy, drowning weight, but the anger was becoming a structural element. It was the rebar in the concrete of her resolve. She opened a second window, the live feed of the Kang Syndicate's headquarters. It was late in Seoul, but the lights in the executive wing were still on. Do-won's silhouette was visible through the floor-to-ceiling glass of the boardroom, standing exactly where his mother had probably told him to stand. Naomi began to compile a new file. She didn't just save the video of the rehearsal. She began to cross-reference the timestamps of Lady Kang's secret meetings with the syndicate's offshore bank transfers. She found the discretionary fund that had been used to pay off the clinic staff to ensure Naomi was discharged without a trace of medical records. She saw the architecture of her own erasure. Lady Kang hadn't just wanted Naomi gone, she wanted the world to believe Naomi Sinclair had never existed. "You taught him how to speak, Lady Kang," Naomi murmured, her eyes cold as she watched the live feed. "But you forgot that I'm the one who taught him how to think. I'm the one who wrote the strategy that saved your company 3 years ago. I'm the one who knows where the ghost partner buried the real power." She reached for the $100 bill that still sat on the edge of the table. She picked it up, feeling the crisp, insulting texture of the paper. She didn't see currency anymore. She saw a prop, a piece of the script. With a few keystrokes, she bypassed the syndicate's primary firewall and planted a sleeper program in the main server. It was a simple piece of code, nearly undetectable. It would wait, it would listen. And when the time was right, when the IPO was at its most vulnerable, it would play the rehearsal video on every screen in the Kang Plaza from the lobby to the boardroom. She wanted the world to see the ruthless Kang Do-won for what he truly was, a boy practicing his lines for a mother who didn't love him. A soft sound came from the bassinet, a small, contented sigh from the twins. Naomi walked over to them, her heart aching with a fierce, protective heat. They would never be props, they would never be assets, and they would never ever have to rehearse their lives. She looked at her reflection in the darkened window of the loft. The hospital gown was gone, replaced by an oversized black sweater she had found in her father's cedar chest. She looked like a shadow, she looked like a ghost. "The play is over, Mother," Naomi said to the empty room, her eyes reflecting the scrolling green code of the syndicate's downfall. "Now we're going to see what happens when the ghost rewrites the ending." The packing of her revenge was no longer a frantic crawl. It was a steady, rhythmic march. She had the ledger, she had the script, and she had the absolute, unshakable knowledge that the Kangs weren't a dynasty, they were a lie. And lies were the easiest things in the world to dismantle if you knew where the first stitch was. She closed the laptop, the click echoing through the loft like a final period at the end of a sentence. The long night of the Sinclair return had only just begun. The transition from Naomi Sinclair to N was not a change of heart, it was a demolition. In the 3 months that followed the freezing rain of her arrival at Property 43B, the loft ceased to be a shelter and became a laboratory of industrial-scale retribution. The physical recovery from her labor was a slow, agonizing climb, but Naomi used the pain as a metronome for her work. Every sharp twinge in her abdomen during a late-night feeding was a reminder of why the Kangs had to fall. Every time she looked at her sons and saw the faint, ghostly trace of Do-Won's jawline, she doubled her efforts to ensure they would never inherit his cowardice. She began by erasing the woman the world knew. Naomi Sinclair, the polished wife, the elegant fixture at charity galas, the lucky commoner who had snared a Mafia prince, was systematically scrubbed from the digital ether. Using the backdoors her father had left in the syndicate servers, she didn't just delete her presence, she corrupted it. Photos of her at events were replaced by broken links. Mentions of her in society columns were buried under mountains of AI-generated noise. She made herself a ghost before she ever reached for the crown. Then she began the construction of N. It started with a single, encrypted white paper distributed to the top tier of global venture capitalists and private equity raiders, men and women who lived in the same stratosphere as the Kangs but viewed them as vulgar upstarts. The paper was titled The Structural Integrity of the Kang IPO, a post-mortem of a living empire. It didn't have a name attached, only a minimalist logo, a silver N slashed through with a single surgical line. The paper was a masterpiece of cold, clinical destruction. It didn't mention the betrayal in the hospital or the $100 bill left on the curb. Instead, it pointed out a 0.4% discrepancy in the Kang's logistics subsidiary, a tiny, almost invisible leak that if pulled would unravel their entire maritime insurance network. It was information only an insider could have, but presented with the detached brilliance of a deity. Within 48 hours, the N identity was the most whispered-about secret in the high-end financial circles of London, New York, and Hong Kong. Who was N? A disgruntled board member, a rogue intelligence agent, a digital phantom. Naomi watched the chatter from her monitor in Moppo, a small, grim smile playing on her lips. She wasn't just building a brand, she was building a shadow that would eventually grow large enough to eclipse the Kang Plaza. She set up a multi-layered communication hub. Inquiries for N were routed through 7 different countries, filtered by a voice modulator that stripped her tone of its femininity and replaced it with a low, vibrating hum that sounded like a machine dreaming. She took her first client, a rival conglomerate in Osaka looking to defend itself against a Kang hostile takeover. Naomi didn't just give them a defense strategy, she gave them the exact coordinates of the Kang's black accounts used to fund the acquisition. When the Kang's move failed, costing them $300 million in a single afternoon, the legend of N was cemented. But the architecture of her revenge required more than just digital sniping. Naomi knew that Lady Kang's power rested on the illusion of invincibility. To break the matriarch, she had to dismantle the myth of the great Kang successor. She began the polishing of the puppet. Using a burner identity, she leaked a series of highly successful but anonymously brokered deals to Do-Won's private office. She made them look like gifts from a secret ally within the syndicate who wanted him to step out from his mother's shadow. It was a classic honey trap of the ego. Do-Won, desperate to prove he wasn't the weakling his mother had humiliated in the rehearsal video, took the bait. He began making aggressive, high-risk moves that were secretly orchestrated by Naomi. Each win he notched was actually a tether she was wrapping around his neck. She was building his confidence so that when she eventually pulled the rug, the fall would be terminal. In the quiet hours when the monitors flickered and the twins were asleep, Naomi practiced a different kind of architecture, the reconstruction of her own body. She moved with a silent, lethal focus through the loft, doing floor exercises that pushed her repaired muscles to the brink of failure. She cut her hair into a sharp, asymmetrical bob that grazed her jawline like a blade. She traded the soft silks of her past life for a wardrobe of structured blacks and charcoals, clothes that felt less like fashion and more like armor. She was no longer the woman who reached for warmth, she was the cold wind that preceded the storm. One night, while monitoring Do-Won's personal communications, she saw a message he had drafted but never sent. It was addressed to her old, deactivated email. "Where are you?" It read, "The boys, are they breathing?" Naomi stared at the cursor blinking at the end of the unsent sentence, for a fleeting second. The old Naomi, the woman who had loved the boy beneath the monster, felt a pang of suffocating grief. Her hand hovered over the keyboard, but then she looked down at the brass key to Property 43B sitting on her desk, and the memory of the hospital room rushed back. the smell of white tea, the architectural precision of his tie, and the word disgusting falling from his lips like a death sentence. She didn't reply, she didn't even save the draft. With a flick of her wrist, she deleted the unsent message from the server, erasing the last trace of his humanity before he could even acknowledge it. "You don't get to ask about their breath," she whispered, her voice cold and resonant in the empty loft. "You traded their air for a seat at your mother's table, now you're going to learn how to choke on it." By the end of the third month, Anne was no longer a ghost, she was an industry. She had successfully diverted 12% of the Kang syndicate's projected IPO valuation into a series of escrow accounts that only she could access. She had 3 of the syndicate's largest shareholders on a private retainer, all of them paying N to protect them from the very company they owned. She was the architect, the builder, and the demolition crew. The N identity was complete. She stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of the loft, looking out at the Seoul skyline. Far in the distance, the Kang Plaza glowed like a golden tooth in the mouth of the city. To everyone else, it looked like a monument to power. To Naomi, it looked like a house of cards standing in a wind tunnel she had just turned on. She picked up a silver pen and traced the N logo onto a fresh piece of parchment. Underneath it, she wrote a single date, the day of the Kang Syndicate's annual general meeting. The invitation was ready. The ghost was coming home, and she wasn't coming for an apology, she was coming for the deed. The packing of her life had shifted. The frantic post-trauma heartbeat had smoothed out into a long, low, rhythmic thrum. She was ready. The N identity was her greatest masterpiece, a mask so perfect that even when she stood face-to-face with the man who had discarded her, he wouldn't see the wife he shamed, he would only see the end of his world. She closed her laptop, the silence of the loft returning heavy and expectant. The architecture was done, now it was time to move in. The Kang Syndicate's initial public offering was meant to be the crowning achievement of a generation, a financial baptism that would wash away the blood and grit of their underworld origins and re-emerge as a legitimate global titan. To the world, the IPO was a juggernaut. To Naomi, it was a bloated, overextended animal, and she knew exactly where to sever the tendons. Sitting in the half-light of the Mapo loft, she watched the digital ticker of the pre-market valuations like a predator watching a heartbeat. She wasn't just looking for a profit, she was orchestrating a controlled exsanguination. The drain began not with a roar, but with a whisper in the dark corners of the logistics sector. Naomi, operating under the clinical end protocols, initiated a series of algorithmic sell-offs through her father's shadow shell companies. These weren't large enough to trigger regulatory alarms, but they were precisely timed to hit the syndicate's maritime insurance bonds during their most vulnerable liquidity windows. It was the financial equivalent of 1,000 paper cuts, each one tiny, but together ensuring the beast would eventually bleed out. As the N identity, she sent a single encrypted memo to the 3 largest institutional investors, the kind of kingmakers whose withdrawal could collapse a market before it even opened. The memo contained no threats, only a set of coordinates to a dormant server she had unearthed from her father's ledger. On that server sat the proof of ghost liabilities, debts the Kang family had hidden in the foundation of their shipping empire, totaling nearly $400 million in unbacked maritime liens. By the time the sun rose over Seoul, the whispers had turned into a low-frequency panic. Naomi watched through a hacked feed of the Kang Plaza's executive level as the atmosphere shifted from celebratory to frantic. Assistants scurried with frantic energy, and the usual air of arrogant untouchability began to fray at the edges. She saw Do-won through the glass of his office, his silhouette rigid, his phone never leaving his ear. He was trying to plug a dam that she had already rigged with dynamite. "You're looking for the leak, Do-won," Naomi murmured, her fingers dancing across a secondary keyboard as she diverted a final 8% of the syndicate's liquid reserves into a N-group escrow account in the Cayman Islands. "But you're looking in the pipes. You should be looking at the architect." She didn't stop at the money. To truly drain the Kangs, she had to drain their credibility. She activated the sleeper program she had planted weeks prior. Suddenly, the syndicate's primary supply chain partners in Southeast Asia received updated fiduciary requirements, all signed with Lady Kang's digital watermark, but containing clauses so restrictive they were practically suicide notes for the partnerships. Panic rippled through the syndicate's alliances. Long-term partners, fearing a sudden shift in Lady Kang's legendary ruthlessness, began to pull back, freezing assets that the syndicate needed to satisfy the IPO's initial margin requirements. The beauty of the architecture was its invisibility. To Lady Kang, it looked like a coordinated attack by a rival conglomerate. To Do-won, it looked like the universe was suddenly conspiring to punish his ambition. Neither of them suspected that the source was a woman they believed was currently rotting in a gutter with $100 bill. In the middle of the chaos, a private line Naomi had kept open chimed. It was a high-priority alert from the syndicate's internal security. Do-won was attempting to bypass the ghost stake protocols Naomi's father had installed decades ago. He was trying to claw back the 40% equity to use as collateral to save the IPO. Naomi leaned back, a cold, sharp thrill running through her. She watched him enter the overrides, his movements desperate on the screen. He hit the final sequence, expecting to see the Kang family crest and a green light of authorization. Instead, the screen turned a deep, bruising violet. A single, stylized N appeared in the center of the monitors, shimmering with a digital frost. She had designed the interface to be a mirror. For 10 seconds, the webcam on Do-won's laptop activated, and Naomi saw him clearly, the dark circles under his eyes, the way his hand shook as he reached for his coffee. He looked haunted. He looked like a man who was realizing the floor beneath him wasn't made of marble but of mist. "It's gone, Do-won," she whispered to the monitor. "The equity, the liquidity, the legacy, I'm taking it all back cent by cent for every hour of that labor you walked away from." By midday, the poisoned IPO was the lead story on every financial news circuit. The valuation had plummeted by 22% before the first bell had even rung. The Kang syndicate wasn't just losing money, they were losing their sense of power. Shareholders were demanding a face-to-face meeting with the ghost behind the N white papers, convinced that only this mysterious entity held the key to the syndicate's survival. Naomi watched the chaos with a detached, surgical focus. She had drained the assets, but the final stage of the architecture required her to be the one to offer the transfusion. She needed them desperate. She needed them to reach for her hand so she could lead them exactly where she wanted them to go. She stood up from the table, her body feeling stronger, the physical weakness of the past months finally replaced by a terrifying, crystalline energy. She walked to the bassinet and looked down at her sons. They were sleeping through the destruction of their father's world, their breathing steady and peaceful. "We're almost there," she told them, her voice soft but ironclad. "He took your names, so I'm taking his empire. When I'm done, the only thing left of the Kang syndicate will be the dust on your shoes." She returned to the laptop and sent a final, anonymous message to the syndicate's board of directors. It was a single sentence that would change the trajectory of the entire conflict. "N is prepared to consult. 1 hour, private link, Do-won must be present." The bait was set. The assets were drained, the poisoned blood was circulating, and the only doctor left in the world was the ghost they had tried to bury. Naomi closed the laptop, the silence of the loft returning, but this time it felt different. It felt like the silence before a building implodes. The long game was entering its endgame. And Naomi Sinclair was no longer just the architect of revenge. She was the executioner. The digital link between the Mapo loft and the Kang syndicate's boardroom was a thin, glowing umbilical cord of power. Naomi sat in the dark, her face illuminated by the cool violet glow of the N interface. She had spent hours configuring the privacy filters. Her voice would reach the boardroom as a low-frequency vibration, and her image would be nothing more than a stylized, shimmering silhouette of the N logo. She was no longer a person to them, she was an oracle. On her secondary monitor, she watched the boardroom camera. The air in that room looked thick enough to choke on. The syndicate's directors, men who had spent their lives crushing competitors like insects, were huddled like sheep in a storm. And there at the head of the table sat Do-won. He had stripped off his suit jacket. His white shirt was wrinkled, and his tie, usually tied with surgical precision, was loosened. He looked like a man who had been running for miles only to realize he was on a treadmill. The join notification chimed in the boardroom. Every head snapped toward the massive display on the wall. The violet N appeared, pulsing slowly like a steady heartbeat. "You are late," Do-won said, his voice raspy and edged with a desperate kind of bravado. "I am exactly where I need to be," the voice of N vibrated through the boardroom speakers, stripped of all human warmth. "Whether you are where you need to be is the more pressing question, Mr. Kang." Do-won winced at the coldness of the tone. He stood up, leaning his palms on the black obsidian table, looking directly into the camera lens as if he could pierce the encryption. "We don't have time for riddles. The IPO is hemorrhaging. Our maritime partners are pulling out, and our credit lines are being frozen by banks we've owned for a decade. My mother says this is a coordinated strike. I say it's a ghost." Your mother is a woman who sees enemies in every shadow because she has cast so many, Naomi replied, her voice echoing with a hollow, metallic resonance. And you, Do-won, are a man who looks for ghosts because you are too afraid to look in the mirror. A murmur of shock rippled through the directors. No one spoke to a Kang that way. Lady Kang, watching from a secure feed in her private study, likely had her finger on a kill switch, but she couldn't press it, not while the N group held the only keys to their liquidity. Whoever you are, Do-won said, his voice dropping to a low, urgent plea, you have dismantled in 3 days what took 30 years to build. You have the leverage, you have the equity, name your price. If it's money, we have it. If it's a seat on this board, it's yours. Just stop the bleed, save the syndicate. Naomi watched him through the screen. She saw the sweat on his brow. She saw the way his fingers twitched, a nervous habit he only had when he was truly terrified. A year ago, she would have reached through the screen to comfort him. Today, she only felt the cold, architectural satisfaction of a job well done. You think this is about a price? Anne asked, the violet logo on the screen shimmering. You think you can buy back the ground you've already lost? You are asking me to save an empire that is built on a foundation of rot. Why should I provide a transfusion to a corpse? Because we are the Kang Syndicate, Do-won shouted, his frustration finally boiling over. We are the bloodline that built this city, we are. You are a son who repeats lines his mother taught him, Anne interrupted, the voice turning sharp as a razor. You are a man who threw away his own legacy for the sake of an asset valuation. You want me to save you? Then tell me, Mr. Kang, what is the most valuable thing you've ever lost? The silence that followed was absolute. Do-won froze. His eyes darted around the room, looking at the directors, then back at the violet N. For a second, just a fraction of a heartbeat, the mask of the ruthless heir slipped. His face softened into a look of profound, agonizing regret. I lost a woman, he whispered. The microphones in the boardroom were so sensitive that even the directors barely heard him, but Naomi heard it with perfect clarity. And my children, I lost them because I was told they were a weakness. I was told they would cost me my crown. And was the crown worth it? Anne asked, the violet light pulsing faster now. No, Do-won said, his voice breaking. He sank back into his chair, burying his face in his hands. The crown is burning and I have nothing left to put out the fire. Naomi felt a sharp, jagged pain in her own chest. It wasn't pity. It was the realization that he finally understood the scale of his failure, but understanding wasn't atonement. If you want my help, Anne said, the voice regaining its clinical edge, you will do exactly as I say. You will sign over the remaining management voting rights to the N Group. You will issue a public statement acknowledging that the syndicate's recent failures were a result of internal fiduciary negligence, and you will prepare for a face-to-face consultation with me at the Kang Plaza boardroom in 48 hours. Face-to-face? Do-won asked, looking up, hope and dread battling in his eyes. You'll come here. I am already there, Do-won, Anne replied. I am in your servers, I am in your bank accounts, and I am in your head. Prepare the room and make sure your mother is present. I want the architect of this ruin to see the demolition in person. Before Do-won could respond, Naomi severed the connection. The violet glow vanished from the boardroom screen, replaced by the standard Kang Syndicate logo, which now looked small and insignificant. In the Mappo loft, Naomi leaned back in her chair, her lungs burning as if she had been underwater. She reached out and touched the side of the car seat where her sons were now stirring, their tiny hands reaching for the air. He begged, she whispered to the empty room. The king of the syndicate begged a stranger to save him. She stood up and walked to the window. The rain had stopped and the city lights were reflecting off the wet pavement like a sea of diamonds. She wasn't a stranger to him, but she was no longer his wife. She was the entity that would decide if he got to keep his name or if he would be erased alongside his mother. The consultation was set. The bait had been swallowed hook and sinker. Now all that remained was the unmasking. Naomi picked up her phone and sent a short, encrypted message to her shadow ally Kenji. Phase 5 engaged. Ready the security footage for the boardroom display. We're going to show the world the rehearsal. She looked at her reflection in the glass. The bob was sharp. Her eyes were cold. She looked like a woman who could walk through fire without blinking. You asked me to save you, Do-won, she said to the distant glow of the Kang Plaza. But I never said I would save the man you are, I'm only saving the seat for the woman I've become. The long game was moving into its final, most dangerous stage. The ghost was no longer content to haunt the halls, she was ready to take the throne. And when the doors to that boardroom opened in 48 hours, the Kangs wouldn't find a savior. They would find the receipt for everything they had ever stolen. She closed the laptop, the violet light fading into the darkness of the loft. The silence was no longer heavy, it was triumphant. The Mappo loft was silent, save for the rhythmic mechanical hum of the server cooling fans and the soft synchronous breathing of the twins in their bassinets. Naomi sat in the dark, her silhouette a sharp, unyielding line against the glow of 3 monitors. She had established the secure bridge, a digital confession booth where the lighting was manipulated to keep her in total shadow, while Kang Do-won remained exposed under the harsh LED panels of the Syndicate's emergency bunker. It was 3:00 a.m. The world was asleep, but the Kang Empire was wide awake and screaming in its death throes. "The link is stable," Naomi's voice vibrated through the modulator, a low, tectonic hum that felt more like a frequency than a sound. "Speak, Mr. Kang, you said you had a final disclosure before the board meeting. You have 5 minutes of my time, do not waste them on corporate jargon." On the screen, Do-won looked like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. He was sitting on a low leather chair, his head bowed, the shadow of his jawline dark with stubble. He didn't look like a mafia boss, he looked like a prisoner of war. "I didn't come to talk about the IPO, Do-won said, his voice a hoarse whisper that barely caught on the microphone. "I came to talk about the ghost. You know everything about this company, you know the ledgers, the offshore accounts, the blood under the floorboards, but you also know the things that aren't in the files, you know the silence." Naomi remained perfectly still, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the mahogany table. "The silence is where the truth lives, Do-won. What truth are you hiding from?" Do-won let out a jagged, bitter laugh that turned into a cough. He reached for a glass of amber liquid on the floor beside him but paused, his hand shaking so violently that he pulled it back. "I'm hiding from the moment I looked at my wife and told her she disgusted me. I'm hiding from the fact that I let my mother turn my heart into a calculated risk assessment." He leaned forward, his eyes bloodshot as he stared into the camera, searching for the human being behind the Violet N logo. "I stood in that hospital room at the clinic. The air smelled like white tea and the blood of my sons. I wanted to fall to my knees. I wanted to tell her that she was the bravest, most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I wanted to take those boys and run until the Syndicate was just a bad memory in the rearview mirror." Naomi felt a cold, sharp spike of adrenaline. The fixer in her wanted to analyze the statement for tactical weakness, but the woman beneath the black sweater felt a ghost of a heartbeat. She tightened her grip on the table until her knuckles turned white. "But you didn't," the voice of N vibrated. "You straightened your tie, you followed the script, you chose the architecture of power over the messy reality of love." "I was a coward," Do-won whispered, and the words seemed to hang in the air between Mappo and the Syndicate bunker like a physical weight. "My mother, she didn't just threaten the company. She told me that if I stayed with Naomi, if I let the Sinclair blood dilute the Kang legacy, she would ensure the children never saw their first birthday. She made it a binary choice, destroy the woman I loved to save the lives she carried or lose them all to her efficiency." Naomi's breath stopped. The monitors seemed to blur for a second, a threat on their lives. She had seen the rehearsal video, seen the psychological grooming, but she hadn't known the depth of the ultimatum. She had seen the cruelty, but she hadn't seen the knife Lady Kang had held to the infants' throats. "So you gave her $100 and a death sentence of silence," N said, the voice flickering with a momentary, jagged edge of genuine human anger before the modulator smoothed it back into steel. "You thought discarding her like a used receipt was an act of protection? You thought leaving her marooned on a curb with no name and no past was mercy." "I thought I could find her later," Do-won cried out, his voice cracking. He stood up and began to pace the small room, his movements frantic. "I thought once the IPO was secure, once I had the crown and could finally strip my mother of her power, I would go to the ends of the earth to find her. I'd spend every cent of the Syndicate's fortune to buy her back, but she vanished. It's like she never existed. My mother erased her so thoroughly that even the clinic's records were wiped before the ink was dry." He stopped packing and looked back at the camera, his expression one of total, unmitigated ruin. "I'm a man who owns a city, but I can't find the mother of my children. And now you're taking the city too, and the irony is, I want you to take it. I want you to burn it all down. If the Kang Syndicate is the price of my soul, then I'm overpaid." The silence in the loft became suffocating. Naomi really watched him not as a target, but as a man who had been crushed by the very machine he was born to lead. For a moment, the urge to speak in her own voice to tell him that she was right there, that the boys were breathing and safe in a room filled with cedar and shadows, was a physical ache in her throat. But then, she looked at the secondary monitor. She saw the sleeper program she had planted. She saw the timestamp of Lady Kang's latest move, a transfer of funds to a private security firm specializing in asset recovery. Even now, with her son falling apart, the matriarch was hunting. "Regret is a luxury of the defeated, Mr. Kang," N said, the voice cold and surgical once more. "You claim you want to save your soul? Souls aren't saved in the dark with confessions and expensive scotch. They are saved in the light where the truth has consequences." "What do you want from me?" Duwon asked, his shoulders slumped. "I want the truth in the boardroom," N replied. "I want you to look your mother in the eye when I play the rehearsal video. I want you to stand up and admit that you are the majority shareholder of a lie. If you truly want to save the woman you lost, you have to be willing to destroy the man she married. Are you prepared to be nobody, Duwon? Are you prepared to walk out of that plaza with nothing but the clothes on your back and the truth in your mouth?" Duwon didn't hesitate. "I would walk through fire if I thought she was waiting on the other side." "Then we have a deal," N said. "The consultation is over. 48 hours, wear your best suit, Duwon. It's the last time you'll ever need it." Naomi cut the feed before he could respond. She sat in the darkness, her chest heaving, her eyes burning. The revelation of the threat against the twins changed the texture of her anger, but it didn't change the destination of her plan. If anything, it made Lady Kang's destruction a moral necessity. She stood up and walked over to the bassinets. She reached down and touched the boy with Duwon's brow, his skin soft and warm. "He's coming for us," she whispered, her voice her own again, thick with a complex, terrifying grief. "He thinks he's coming to a stranger to save his empire. He doesn't know he's coming to his executioner to find his heart." She looked back at the black screen. Duwon's confession was recorded. Every word of his regret was now a weapon in her arsenal. She had the script of the cruelty, and now she had the testimony of the victim. The architecture of her revenge was no longer just about money or power. It was about the total, systematic dismantling of the Kang bloodline's ability to hurt anyone ever again. She returned to the table and began to finalize the N-group presentation for the general meeting. She added a new slide, a direct link to the security footage of the nursery Lady Kang had emptied. The long game was no longer a game. It was a war of restoration. And as the first light of dawn began to gray the windows of the Mapo loft, Naomi Sinclair realized that the hardest part of the unmasking wouldn't be showing him who she had become. It would be deciding if the man who confessed in the dark was worth saving from the fire she was about to light. She closed the laptop, the click sounding like the cocking of a hammer. The time for talking was over. The ghost was ready to speak in the only language the syndicate understood: total, unrepentant truth. The air in the Kang Syndicate's primary boardroom was pressurized, the kind of heavy artificial atmosphere that precedes a controlled implosion. Outside the floor-to-ceiling glass, Seoul was a jagged landscape of neon and steel, but inside the only light came from the massive digital displays and the cold, recessed LEDs in the ceiling. Lady Kang sat at the head of the table, her posture so rigid she looked carved from the same black obsidian as the surface before her. To her right, Duwon stood, his face a mask of exhausted resolve, his eyes fixed on the doors. The directors, 12 men who controlled the flow of billions, sat in a row of high-backed leather chairs, their faces pale in the blue light of the plummeting IPO tickers. They had been told the ghost was coming. They had been told that N would appear to offer a transfusion for their dying empire. They didn't know they were sitting in a courtroom. At exactly 10:00 a.m., the heavy double doors at the far end of the room didn't just open, they were retracted by an external command. The sound of high heels against the marble floor was a slow, rhythmic percussion, a heartbeat returning to a dead body. Naomi Sinclair walked into the room. She didn't look like the woman who had bled out for 18 hours in a clinic bed. She didn't look like the woman who had been discarded with a $100 bill. She wore a suit of structured midnight black wool, her hair a sharp, lethal blade against her jawline. In her hand, she carried a single black flash drive. The silence that followed her entry was absolute. It was the silence of men seeing a ghost take physical form. Duwon's breath hitched, a jagged, audible sound that cut through the room. His hands, resting on the table, began to shake. Lady Kang, however, didn't flinch. She narrowed her eyes, her lips curling into a look of profound, icy boredom. "Naomi," the matriarch said, her voice like a dry leaf skittering over stone. "I see you've spent your severance on a tailor. I suppose I should have expected a Sinclair to crawl back eventually. But this is a meeting for the N group. Security, remove this woman." "Security isn't listening to you, mother," Naomi said. Her voice wasn't the modulated hum of N anymore. It was her own, clear, resonant, and vibrating with the weight of her father's legacy. "Security reports to the majority shareholder, and as of 4:00 a.m. this morning, that isn't the Kang family." Naomi walked to the head of the table, stopping directly opposite Lady Kang. She didn't look at Do-won, not yet. She kept her focus on the woman who had scripted her destruction. She reached out and plugged the black drive into the central hub. "You spent 30 years building a house of mirrors," Naomi said, her eyes locked on Lady Kang. "You taught your son that people are assets and that love is a liability. You thought you could erase me because you didn't see me. You saw a commoner. You saw a receptacle for the bloodline. You forgot to look at the name on the foundation." The massive wall screens flickered. The IPO tickers vanished, replaced by a 1994 incorporation deed. The document was signed by Arthur Sinclair and a young, hungry Kang patriarch. But the secondary clause, the Ghost Protocol, highlighted in blood-red text, showed a 40% equity stake that had never been transferred to the Kangs. It had been held in a blind trust, activated only by the birth of a Sinclair heir. "My father didn't just build your company," Naomi whispered, the sound carrying to every corner of the room. "He owned the dirt it sits on. I am not here as your daughter-in-law, I am here as your landlord." The directors began to whisper, a frantic, buzzing sound. Lady Kang stood up, her face finally losing its composure, the mask of the matriarch cracking to reveal a desperate, cornered predator. "This is a forgery, a Sinclair trick. Do-won, do something." But Do-won was looking at Naomi. He wasn't looking at the screens or the equity. He was looking at the woman he had confessed to in the dark. He saw the fire in her eyes, the iron in her spine, and the absolute, terrifying beauty of her survival. "I can't do anything, mother," Do-won said, his voice stronger than it had been in years. "Because she's right, I've seen the ledger, I've heard the truth." "You've heard nothing," Lady Kang hissed. "I've heard the rehearsal," Naomi interrupted. She tapped a key on her tablet. The screens changed again. The boardroom was suddenly filled with the grainy, high-definition footage of Lady Kang's private study from 3 months ago. The directors watched in stunned silence as the matriarch took her son's face in her hands and forced him to repeat the words. "She is a mistake. She is repulsive. I am disgusted by her." The cruelty of the recording was physical. It was a violation of the room's dignity. The directors looked away, ashamed, but Naomi kept her eyes on Lady Kang. "You weaponized his love to protect your pride," Naomi said, her voice dropping to a low, lethal frequency. "You threatened the lives of my sons to ensure your optics remained pure. You thought you were the authority in this family. You thought you were the one who decided who lives and who is erased." Naomi leaned over the table, her shadow falling over the obsidian surface, eclipsing the matriarch. "I am the N group," Naomi declared, the words ringing out like a gavel. "I am the 40% that makes you a minority. I am the creditor who is calling in your debt, and I am the mother who is taking back everything you stole." She turned to the board. "As the majority shareholder, I am moving for the immediate removal of Lady Kang from all executive positions. I am freezing her personal accounts pending a full audit of the ghost liabilities her husband left behind, and I am stalling the IPO until the Sinclair name is restored to the masthead." "You can't do this," Lady Kang gasped, her hand clutching at her throat. "The syndicate will collapse the markets." "The markets will survive," Naomi said, finally turning her gaze to Do-won. "But the syndicate is dead. From this moment on, we are Sinclair Kang, and we will be led by someone who knows the difference between a person and a receipt." The room was silent. The coup was over. It hadn't been a battle, it had been an execution. The directors, seeing the shift in power, began to stand one by one, bowing not to Lady Kang but to the woman in the black suit. Lady Kang looked around the room, seeing her empire dissolve into the shadows. She looked at her son, reaching for him, but Do-won stepped back, putting his hands in his pockets, the same pockets where he had once hidden a $100 bill. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His silence was his final defection. Naomi walked around the table and stood in the seat that had belonged to the matriarch. She didn't sit. She simply rested her hand on the back of the chair. I am the authority you fear, Lady Kang, Naomi said, her voice devoid of heat, filled only with the cold, architectural certainty of a winner. Because I have nothing left to lose and you have just lost everything. She looked at Do-won. You said you'd walk through fire, the fire is out, now let's see if you can walk through the truth. Naomi turned and walked toward the doors, her heels clicking against the marble once more. She didn't look back at the ruin she had left behind. She had a loft in Mappo to return to, she had 2 sons who were waiting for their mother, and she had a city that finally knew her name. The boardroom coup was complete. The ghost was no longer haunting the plaza, she was ruling it. And as Naomi Sinclair stepped out into the crisp soul morning, the disgusting woman was nowhere to be found. There was only the architect of a new world, and she was just getting started. The transition of power was not marked by a celebration, but by a profound and heavy quiet that settled over the top floor of the Kang Plaza. In the weeks following the boardroom coup, the building had undergone a spiritual cleansing. The obsidian desks remained, and the glass walls still offered a panoramic view of a city that bowed to the syndicate, but the air no longer carried the scent of Lady Kang's suffocating lilies. It smelled of cedar, old paper, and the faint, milky sweetness of 2 infants who now had a nursery adjacent to the CEO's private suite. Naomi Sinclair sat in the chair that had once been the throne of her destruction. She was dressed in a suit of ivory silk, a deliberate choice, a refusal to hide in the shadows any longer. She was the new sovereign, the architect who had stopped being a ghost to become a ruler. Before her lay the finalized merger papers between the N Group and the Sinclair Kang Holdings. With a single stroke of a silver pen, she didn't just reclaim her father's legacy. She swallowed the syndicate whole, ensuring that the name Kang would forever be a secondary note to the name Sinclair. The door to her office opened softly. It wasn't a director or a security team, it was Do-won. He didn't walk with the arrogant, predatory stride of the Mafia prince she had first met. He moved like a man who was learning to navigate a world where he was no longer the center of gravity. He dressed simply now, his expensive ties replaced by open collars, his eyes no longer searching for his mother's approval. He stopped a respectful distance from her desk, his gaze lingering on the twin bassinets near the window where his sons were napping under the watchful eye of a silent elite guard. The audit is complete, Do-won said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of a man who had seen the bottom of his own soul. My mother's offshore holdings have been liquidated into the Sinclair Kang Education Trust. She's at the villa in Jeju under permanent supervision. She keeps asking for her ledger, but the doctors say she's started to forget what the numbers mean. Naomi looked up from her papers. She didn't feel the surge of triumph she had expected. She only felt a vast, clinical peace. Memory is a mercy she didn't afford me, Do-won. If she's forgotten the empire, then she's finally free of the burden of hatting me. Do-won stepped closer, his shadow falling across the desk. In us, are we free of it? Naomi stood up and walked toward the window, looking out at the city she now owned. The sunset was bleeding across the horizon, painting the skyscrapers in shades of bruised purple and gold. There is no us, Do-won. There is the Sinclair Kang Corporation and there are the children. You are a consultant on the Maritime Board because you are the only one who knows the roots. You are in this building because I chose to let you stay. But don't mistake my pragmatism for a reunion. I know, he whispered. He turned to look at her, the light from the window catching the honest, jagged regret in his eyes. I'm not asking for the wife I betrayed. I'm not even asking for the woman who took my company. I'm just asking for a chance to be the man who earns the right to know his son's middle names. Naomi turned back to him. She saw the man who had confessed in the dark, the man who had been willing to become nobody to save her. She saw the father he could be and the ghost of the husband he had failed to be. The architecture of this life is mine now, Do-won, she said, her voice soft but absolute. I have built a world where you are no longer the authority. If you want to be in it, you will follow my blueprints. You will be a father in the light and a subordinate in the office. You will earn their respect, and perhaps in a decade or two you will earn my conversation. But for now you are a man on probation in a kingdom I built from the $100 you left on my curb. Do-won bowed his head, a deep, traditional gesture of subservience that he had never offered even to his mother. I accept those terms. He stayed for a moment longer, watching the boys sleep before turning and walking out of the office. He didn't look back. He knew that the woman behind that desk was no longer a Sinclair or a Kang. She was something entirely new, something forged in the fire of an 18-hour labor and tempered in the cold of a Mappo loft. Naomi returned to her seat. She picked up the black flash drive her father had left her, the one that had started it all. She tucked it into a velvet-lined box in the top drawer of her desk. The long game was over. The pieces were off the board. She leaned back and closed her eyes, listening to the quiet breathing of her children. They were safe. They were wealthy beyond measure. And most importantly, they were hers. She had taken the throne alone, not because she was lonely, but because she was the only one capable of holding the weight of it without crushing the people beneath her. The new sovereign opened her eyes and looked at the next file on her desk, a proposal for a Sinclair-funded foundation for maternal health in the Mapo district. She picked up the pen and began to write. The story of Naomi Sinclair, the discarded wife, had ended in a hospital room in the dark. But the reign of Naomi Sinclair, the ghost queen of soul, was only on its first page. And as she signed her name in bold, unyielding ink, she knew that the most dangerous thing any man could ever do was underestimate a woman who had nothing left to lose but her children. She was no longer reaching for warmth, she was the sun, and from this height the world looked exactly the way she had designed it. The throne was hers, the children were safe, the debt was paid in full.